As a part of the outreach ministry of the First Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana, we are pleased to present our pastor, William E. Hull, speaking from the church's pulpit.
Star of the Reformation. That name given him not merely to try to renew the church in its constant transitions, nor even to reform the church, but rather the first to go to the radical heart of the church's problem and sound a note of revolt against the church. Unless we look at someone like this, and we could have used John Huss, but I'll tell you at the end why I chose Wyclif, we will not understand the famous reformers like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the like. We have seen how there was a time of ferment when people like the mendicants or wandering friars tried to breathe new life into medieval Christianity. But John Wyclif, working in England and coming out of our own Anglo-American heritage, sounded a note that was very crucial. As I tell you a little about him, I would like for you to think, what's it like to be a John the Baptist of the Reformation? What's it like to be ahead of your time? What's it like to plow new ground that only later will others begin to take for granted? And as I described something of what he revolted against, I hope you will realize what Christianity could have been, indeed what it used to be, and how important it is that some people have the courage to think in totally new ways about what Christianity is supposed to be. This can be a little briefer than some of our leaders because we know almost nothing about the early life of John Wyclif. We don't even know when he was born. He was born no earlier than 1324, no later than about 1330. So right in the 20s of the 14th century, around, let's say, 1325, in Yorkshire, England. This is near Lincoln. This is up in a beautiful section of England. He was born. We can infer at least two things. One, that he must have come from an educated, cultured family, because as soon as possible they sent him off to Oxford University, which then was the great premier university of England. And they must have been a devout family because they sent him there to train for the priesthood. Now, England, of course, at that time was Roman Catholic, very strongly so. And so John Wyclif grew up as a highly trained priest. In fact, the first thing we know about him was that he was a brilliant student and stayed on as a teacher. He quickly became the master, which meant the supervisor or principal of Balliol College, which is one of the oldest and most historic colleges at Oxford. He became the professor in the endowed chair of theology. They started a study house called Canterbury. He was made the warden of that. So here is a man, very brilliant, who really was recognized as the brightest light on the entire faculty. Now, more important than that, though, is to realize the period in which he lived. Let me just test one thing. A very popular recent history is by Barbara Tuchman, and it's called A Distant Mirror. And it is subtitled The Calamitous 14th Century. How many of you have read any of Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror? Okay, that's a few. Well, it's beautiful reading. It's fascinating. That's a big book. It's 700 or 800 pages. But it is just an interesting way to get into that period of time. She wrote, in fact, she has a section on John Wyclif, and the reason she calls it a distant mirror is because she feels if we will look at the turmoil, the upheaval, the calamity of the 14th century, it will, from a great distance, show us something of what might happen in our chaotic times. Not that this is like the same, but anytime you have that many changes, some major revolutions are bound to result. You just can't practice business as usual when everything nailed down is coming loose. Well, I can't characterize the century. That would use up my time. This was the period of the 100-Year War. This was the period of the Great Black Plague. This was the period when feudalism was giving way to nationalism. This was the period when the great Holy Roman Empire of Europe was beginning to break up into nation states that were emerging. This was a period when the knights and feudal lords were giving way to princes and to kings. For example, if you're an English major, it was the period of Chaucer. In fact, Wyclif and Chaucer were intimate friends. And many people think that in the Canterbury Tales, when Chaucer wrote about the village parson, that he used John Wyclif, who for a time was pastor in Lutterworth, as his model. So, if you want to read probably history's most famous description of John Wyclif, read the village pastor in Chaucer's Tales. Well, at Oxford, Wyclif spent most of his career as a quiet, technical scholar. In fact, he lived at most 60 years, from this 1324 to 1384. We know when he died. And out of those 60 years, he was a reformer only the last 8. Now, I say that to make 2 or 3 points. Sometimes we think scholars only live in ivory towers, and they are very removed from the practical, earthy concerns of the marketplace. But do you realize how many of the explosive personalities we have dealt with came out of a very cloistered, sheltered, scholarly, academic environment? That's where Thomas Aquinas was. That's where Martin Luther is going to come from. So, what actually happened was that the more Wyclif dug into the ultimate foundations, the theory and the underpinnings of life in that century, the more he decided that the whole relationship of Christianity and society, the whole place of the church in the world, needed to be rethought. Now, it's right here that I've got to tell you an important contribution he made in the area of church and state, because you won't understand the end of his life unless you begin to realize the delicate relationship between religion and politics in the art of Reformation. That, incidentally, is very crucial for Martin Luther, John Calvin. All of the reformers are not just religious idealists off in a pulpit. A great deal has to do with the way they are speaking for God to political realities. So let me explain that, and I believe you will see where I get some of my positions on church and state today. This was the period which we call the Babylonian captivity of the church. Now let me explain what that means. The Roman Catholic Church, of course, dominated medieval Europe. They had been, from the 2nd century on, in the city of Rome in Italy. But Italy was not a nation. It was tiny little feudal monarchies. And they were in a great deal of chaos and war with each other in this calamitous 14th century. So the church, the papacy, the Vatican as we call it, finding itself in such an unstable political environment, moved to France. How many of you knew that? How many of you knew that the papacy didn't stay in Rome all of these centuries, but it moved to a place called Avignon? And when they were there, they were why did they move there? Because France was the first part of Europe to congeal as a united nation. It was the first to get a king of France powerful enough to offer the church the protection of the throne, the crown. So the point was, all of Europe was getting unstable, unrest, war, political upheaval. So the church went off to Avignon, and that was called the Babylonian captivity of the church. They didn't go to Babylon. The reason it was called that was, this is the lowest point in all of the history of the Roman Catholic Church. This is when the popes were most political, materialistic, making diplomatic deals. This is where they were more intent on taxation and accumulating wealth. In other words, this is when the church was more worldly than at any other time in its history. And so even the Catholics themselves were very ashamed of the crude politics by which the church was living in this period. Now let me tell you why that's so important. It's important because, as you know from the time of the Norman conquest, England and France had been hereditary enemies. And now the Roman Catholic Church was in the backyard of their enemy. And right during Wyclif's time, the King of England went to war with the King of France. And with the Catholic Church right there, it almost looked as if their enemy was supporting their church. Now this was very important because the church all through the Middle Ages was a tremendous economic empire. To be very specific, during Wyclif's time, ecclesiastical taxation, that is the money that you had to pay to the church by force of law, was twice as much in England as all of the taxes that you paid to the government. In other words, the revenues of the crown in England were only half as much as the revenues that the church took out of England to France that they were fighting. Now you can imagine what the noblemen of England thought of that arrangement. Furthermore, in the time of Wyclif, the church owned by title, by deed, having been deeded over, the church owned 1/3 of the entire domain of England. I mean by that they owned 1/3 of the real estate, the land in England. And so they had an overwhelming economic superiority. Their clergymen were exempt from civil justice. In other words, they had what we would call in Washington diplomatic immunity. They could break a law in England and get away with it because they were subjects, you see, of the Vatican, of a foreign power, and England couldn't touch them. The clergy in this period were very corrupt. Just like the papacy going through its moral low point, the priests did the same. Many priests could, from their bishops for a modest price, get a certificate allowing them to keep a concubine. That's a woman, ladies. All I want to say about that. Many of the priests at this time would charge to observe the Eucharist. In other words, they wouldn't say Mass for the people except for a fee. And so religion had become very crass, very materialistic, very profit-making. Many of the ecclesiastical officers had a retinue, they had fine horses, they rode in chariots, they had servants going after them, their guards were dressed in mail. In other words, it was simply a time when they swaggered about very much like temporal rulers. It got so bad that Parliament finally decided in 1366, when Wyclif was moving into his adult maturity now at Oxford, they decided to pass a law refusing to send all of these enormous taxes to the Roman Catholic Church in Avignon. Actually, right then, and I'm not going to belabor this, but it was the worst it had ever been, because the papacy in France had gotten so corrupt that some Italians had gotten together and elected an Italian pope, Urban VI. And I don't know whether you know it or not, but the Catholic Church for those some 50 to 60 years had two popes competing with each other. One in Italy, one in France. Well, you see, that's just That's just ridiculous. So what does Wyclif do about this? He writes a very formal, almost philosophical kind of paper entitled On the Role of Civil Authority. And he advanced the notion, now you just listen to this a minute. He advanced the notion that rulership was stewardship. That is, God owns everything. Owns the lands, owns the money, owns the jewels, owns the crown. All right? So, rulership is a stewardship if you do not exercise it wisely. In other words, if you don't carry out what has been granted to you properly, if you abuse the trust, your tenure as a ruler is forfeited. Now, what does that mean? By his theory, that means that if the church did not properly use its lands and goods, they could be taken away from it. By whom? And Wyclif said, they can be taken away from them by the civil authorities, whom God has ordained, quoting the Bible, to rule in the secular realm. Now, that's a revolution. In England at this time, the church owned so much property and had such rich taxation powers that many of the highest political offices were held by priests. In other words, you're aware, Cardinal Wolsey and others, how cardinals could be in the cabinet, as it were, of the king, advisors. They would be top politicians. Wyclif said, separation of church and state. The church should be in the spiritual area, the state should be in the temporal area. A priest, therefore, should not be a political officer, and the political leaders, the crown, should be free to take these holdings away from the church if the church does not handle them properly. Well, when he said this opened a floodgate. Because immediately Wyclif began to say, the reason for this is every Christian is a priest. If you say the priest has authority, then we just all have authority because we are all priests. The New Testament says so, priesthood of believers. And so he began to protest all of the ways in which the church had commercialized religion. He began to protest indulgences. He began to protest the treasury of merit. This is the way people paid to get their sins forgiven, or they paid to get somebody out of purgatory. Everything that was tied to money, Wyclif began to protest. But then he took it to the farthest extent. Before I tell you what he did that broke the back of the whole thing, let me explain one other thing about this relationship. When he began to talk like this about the church, he tapped into a powerful political sentiment. The king's brother, the heir apparent to the throne, most of the ranking royalty of England said, hey, we like that. Because this foreign church has had us by the neck too long. In other words, there were a lot of people in the 14th century that wanted to do exactly what Henry VIII eventually did 150 years later. In other words, they wanted to disestablish a foreign church, and in this rising tide of nationalism, they wanted a church not of Rome, not of Avignon. They wanted a church of England. So their money would stay at home and their power would stay at home. And Wyclif was implying that that was legitimate. And therefore, they began to protect him. Now what happened? No sooner did he start writing like this than the Pope in Avignon issued 5 bulls. That is not an animal. A papal bull is an official request to arrest a person for heresy. And so he was saying, I want that man silenced, but the princes of England wouldn't let it happen. So all through the early to mid-70s here, 1370s, Wyclif had the protection of the royalty. But then he went one step too far. I'm trying. It was totally logical. Once he said, we're all priests, and we're all to minister, the priest had a stronghold that nobody, in other words, the priest could do something that nobody else could do. And that was based on the Catholic doctrine. Now this is going to be a long word, but it's not going to hurt. It's like a sugar-coated pill. Just hear it and get over it right quick. The priest had a unique role based on the doctrine called transubstantiation. Now, Julie, you can say that. Transubstantiation. Let me tell you what that means. Of course, their worship was based on the Mass, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And transubstantiation literally meant that the bread and wine was transformed, transferred into the substance, transubstantiation, into the substance of the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, you have probably heard that was one of the great doctrines that was debated in the Reformation. But you don't really understand the point. The point is nobody could do that but a priest. In other words, the priest could work a miracle with the host, with the elements. And as long as the priest could do that, and as long as the people believed that only that priest could turn that Lord's Supper into the real presence of Christ, he could charge them all he wanted to. He was different. They couldn't do that, but he could. Well, Wyclif was already saying, but we're all a priest. So he carried his logic one step further and he said, transubstantiation isn't true. And what he came up with, you might call consubstantiation, which would really mean the substance of Christ is with. Con is a Latin word meaning with. It's not that bread and wine simply turn into literal blood and flesh, transferred into that. It is rather that Christ in His grace comes and stands with us as we eat that bread and wine. He is there. He is really present. But it's not that the priest has worked some hocus pocus. It's that Christ is there standing beside, and He's beside any time two or three are gathered together. Well, in doing that, Wyclif attacked one of the most cherished popular doctrines of all. People didn't want to give that up. That was going too far. They didn't like. It was indulgences, everything that cost money was very unpopular. But the people had almost a magical approach to the Lord's Supper at this time, and they didn't want Him puncturing that balloon. So He lost His princes and kings' protection. He began to be viewed as a heretic. The Oxford faculty, which of course was all Catholic, rose up and voted as a faculty to condemn his teachings. He had to leave Oxford and become a village pastor at Lutterworth. And it is from there that he was in virtual retirement. And 2-3 years later, he died of, he had terrible crippling rheumatism, and then he died of a stroke. Well, what did he do in those last 3 or 4 years? He lost his political clout. He lost a lot of his popular favoritism because he'd become too much of a reformer. He'd gotten too far ahead of the times. Well, here's what he did. He organized a group of wandering preachers. They were called the Lollards. If you've ever heard of the Lollards, they were the ones who went around from place to place. And what was their assignment? In place of all of this Catholic tradition, the indulgences and the Mass and all the rest, Wyclif said, put one thing, the Bible. Well, now there's a big problem with that. The Bible was written at that time only in Latin, and only the priests were educated enough to read it.
The common people couldn't read Latin. And so if you say, in place of all of these Catholic medieval superstitions, or whatever he wanted to call them, and by the way, he was awfully aggressive. He was the first person to call that Pope in France the Antichrist. If you've ever gotten the idea, the Pope is the Antichrist, well, Wyclif started that. So he was pretty tough on him. But a Latin Bible would have ruined his reform. So while he was in virtual retirement, he got the scholars that had been around him, he supervised their translation of the Bible into vernacular, commonplace English. Now, he did not translate from the original Greek manuscripts. We're not that far along. We haven't found those yet. He translated from the Vulgate, which is the standardized Latin Bible. But this was the first Bible in the English language, the Wyclif Bible. Have some of you ever heard of the Wyclif Bible translators? These are the people that are missionaries. You remember Elizabeth Elliot, Gates of Splendor, the martyrdom of her husband in the Amazon, the Indian tribe. Well, they were Wyclif Bible translators. They have named that translation movement, missionary translators, for Wyclif because he is the father, the original father of the English Bible. Now, he did not do a lot of the translating. He was getting old and suffering and he was infirm, but it was clearly his inspiration, his genius, his driving power. So he really did two things. He started a group of itinerant preachers, the Lollards, and he put a colloquial, vernacular English Bible in their hands. Now, I started to bring some of the quotations of the church about what they meant. The church condemned that. They said, he has substituted the language of Angles, meaning Anglo-Saxon English, for the language of angels, meaning the Latin, of Rome. He has taken a holy language and prostituted it to the masses. They were outraged. They were indignant. They said, this man, is the arch emissary of Satan. So, 3 years later, before they could really do all of their damage, he died. The Lollards soon were suppressed because a very strong pro-Catholic king ascended the throne in England. The papacy moved back to Rome and got stabilized again and headed for the glories, of the high Middle Ages. And so Wyclif's movement fizzled out. It didn't lead, like it did in Germany, to a permanent Reformation. In fact, by the time the papacy was reestablished the Archbishop of Canterbury, who would have been, of course, a Catholic at that time, not an Anglican, that hadn't started yet, decided that Wyclif should be disinterred from holy ground. That is, dig up his grave, which is in a church cemetery, and put it out at a pagan place. So they did that. But within 100 years, the Pope had decided these ideas are so devastating that his remains must be dug up, his bones must be burned, the residue ground up, and his ashes sprinkled over the countryside so that not a flake of Wyclif could ever be found again. And by 1410, that had been done. Well, if history ever rises up to condemn someone, it would have been John Wyclif. They eradicated him from the face of the earth. Now, a few closing reflections. Wyclif was a reformer before his time. But it's almost as if as they began to stamp out the bonfire, it's almost as if a tiny little match he dropped began to burn unnoticed. For you see, during the time he was at Oxford, the King of England married a princess of Bohemia. Now, Bohemia is over in Central Europe, kind of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, right down through there, if you know medieval maps. What difference does that make? The difference it makes is that people from Bohemia started coming to England because one of theirs was the Queen. And they started studying at Oxford, and they got the ideas of John Wyclif. They went back to Bohemia with these ideas, and a man named John Huss picked them up. Well, John Huss decided to become a reformer in Europe, Bohemia. And he simply preached the sermons of Wyclif verbatim. Took over his repudiated revolution and transplanted it to Bohemia. Well, they didn't wait for his bones. Most of you know what they did to John Huss. They burned him alive at the stake. But there's a problem. They didn't get around to that until his ideas were out to influence an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. So Wyclif failed. His heir apparent, John Huss, failed. They were both ahead of their time. Why did Luther succeed? That, in the movies, you would be called "Come Back for Next Week's Installment." But I will tell you, before I can explain that, in telling you why they did not succeed, I can in part tell you why Luther did. They did not succeed because the spirit of nationalism was not yet strong enough to protect them from ecclesiastical power by civil power. Whereas by the time Luther came along, the princes of Germany were so determined to make a Germany that they protected Luther to the point of starting a German church. Which is a way of saying often reform works when secular allies are on its side. Who was the most original? Who was the most creative? Who was the most forward-looking? Not Luther, not Calvin. That agenda had already been laid down. But the times were not right. Which is a way of saying that very often success or failure is not a factor of whether you're right, or whether you're courageous, or whether you're smart. Success or failure is often measured by whether the times are ready for your particular revolution. Now, we're hearing a lot today. One small commercial. We're hearing a lot today about working for results, achieving desirable outcomes. I'm for all of that. That's very sophisticated in all management theory today. You're supposed to be able to judge every organization by its outcomes, and they usually mean within 12 months. In other words, if I don't so work in this church that in 12 months we will have desirable outcomes, I'm a failure. Wyclif was a failure. He was a failure for 200 years because humanity was groaning and struggling to mature enough to be ready for the day when everybody could be a priest and when every plowboy could read the Bible in their own language. And that day finally came, and everything he stood for you take for granted, and you haven't even sweated a drop over what he died to make possible. So give thanks, not only for the successes who become heroes in the right time, but give thanks for the pioneers who sometimes become martyrs out of season because we weren't ready when they were.
This concludes Dr. Hall's sermon. We pray that its message has brought new insight to your life. If there is any way that Dr. Hall or our staff may be of Christian service to you, please do not hesitate to call or write us. We will give your inquiry a prompt, courteous, and confidential reply. Our address is First Baptist Church, 543 Ockley Drive, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71106. The telephone number is area code 318-865-8414.